Hello, everyone. Welcome to this educational program by the Association of Foreign Press Correspondents in the United States, AFPC-USA. I'm Patricia Vasconcellos, a board member of the association and White House Correspondent for SBT Brazilian TV Network. Pretty often we see a story where an institution, a company, or even governments are cyber attacked. Hackers can put in risk the security and data of civilians. And we, as foreign journalists, we have reported cases of companies here in the United States that had to stop working for a while, stop the activities, do hacking into computers and systems. So what local and international laws say about this, and can we ever stop cyber threats? So today we are learning from our guest today, Duncan Hollis. He's already connected here with us, an expert on treaties and the application of international law to cyberspace. Duncan, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. It's a real pleasure to be here.
Duncan Hollis is Laura Carnell Professor of Law at Temple University, Beasley School of Law, and also co-directs the university's Institute for Law, Innovation, and Technology. He is currently a non-resident scholar at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and an elected member of the American Law Institute, where he serves as an advisor on its project to draft a fourth restatement on the foreign relations law to the United States. Professor Hollis' research focuses on public international law, the law of treaties, interpretation, and global cybersecurity. He's the editor of the Oxford Guide to Treaties, which was awarded in 2013, a certificate of merit for high technical craftsmanship and utility to practicing lawyers. His cyber-related research examines international law's role in regulating cyber space. He's also the author of several books, including International Law, Defending Democracies, Combating Foreign Election Interference in a Digital Age. His more than 30 articles and book chapters have appeared in various publications, including the American Journal of International Law, Texas Law Review, Southern California Law Review, Harvard Journal of International Law, and Virginia Journal of International Law. Previously, Professor Hollis served as an attorney advisor in the Office of the Legal Advisor at the U.S. State Department, or Department of State, where he participated in various bilateral and multilateral treaty negotiations, as well as litigation of 2 cases before the International Court of Justice. So, Professor Hollis, as I said, this topic that you were an expert and have been working on it, cyber threats. Very often we as foreign journalists, we tell this story about something that is, putting our society in risk. How challenging is this threat, cyber threat, today in our daily lives?
I mean, I think it's very challenging. It also is a constantly evolving threat, but it comes kind of in at least 3 forms, right? When computer scientists talk about the threats to networks and systems, they talk about it in terms of confidentiality losses, integrity losses, and availability losses. So confidentiality losses is when we read, that your credit card account was, a credit card company was hacked, and information that it was intended to be confidential is no longer confidential. It's been put out there on the dark web. Availability losses is when with the most obvious example is ransomware, where suddenly you're finding data that you would like to have access to has been encrypted in a way that you can't access, usually with a request to pay some money to get it back. Sometimes also with a threat that if you don't pay the money, it will be released to the public. So kind of a double extortion. Mm-hmm. And then the one that I think gets, a fair bit of attention is the integrity losses. That is the idea that increasingly computer networks and systems exist to support other infrastructure. And so there's always this kind of persistent question of, Could cyber operations take down or suspend power in a power grid, or affect water filtration plants or civilian nuclear power station, and with real risks to life and property as a result? I mean, I think the frequency of the former, the confidentiality losses, is much greater than examples we have of the integrity losses, like the threats against power. But there are some examples that I think keep people up at night.
We have seen examples of nations, states, countries trying to put laws and trying to organize themselves in a way to fight this challenge. But do we actually have rules, clear rules at the road, that define how states should behave when a cyber attack happens? When government knows that there are, virtual gangs operating?
Sure. Yeah. So I think, first of all, you're absolutely correct that pretty much almost all nation states have now enacted some domestic criminal law that criminalizes private, hackers, right? That, stealing people's information. There's actually a famous, it was called the I Love You virus, which was released now almost 20 years ago, that caused, tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of dollars of damage around the world. And the author was found in the Philippines, and they wanted to arrest him, but the Philippines at the time did not have such a statute. So I think that kind of has gotten most states to have domestic criminal law. The problem is, whether it's, private actors or states, the nature of the internet being global is that most people don't hack in their own territory, right? It is transnational in nature. And so I think that's led to this question of, well, what does international law have to say about this? And it was only about a decade ago that was still an open question, with some people saying, oh, this environment is too novel, the technology is too new, so we need new rules, and there's no existing rules. It's a law-free zone. I think nation states and others have increasingly recognized that's not the case. There are existing international law rules. And beginning around 2013, a group of experts, governmental experts at the United Nations, started to say that, right? You started to have consensus reports issued that said, we all agree that international law in its entirety applies to cyberspace. The human rights we have offline, we also have online. And that, over the last decade or so, has become, I think, the dominant position, such that I don't think there's any government out there today that contests the applicability of international law to cyber behavior. I think it's now a question of how does it apply, especially as we've seen not just cyber criminals, but over the last decade to 15 years, nation states have begun to build up cyber capacity, whether for intelligence purposes or having military cyber units that can be deployed in conflicts. So it's no longer a domain where if you're hacked, that it's some private. It's no longer the teenager in the basement. It's no longer necessarily a group of cyber criminals. You have to take account of the possibility that it might be a nation state or a proxy of a nation state that's engaging in the operation.
You mentioned the United Nations that the General Assembly approved in 2018, if I am not wrong, two separate proposals for the creation of two working groups regarding cyberspace. Is there the right place to decide those questions today? The United Nations, for example, you were there at the UN a couple of days ago, where you were part of the open-ended working group, which is one of those initiatives, right? So two questions: where to decide those questions today, cybersecurity, and this group at the United Nations that you were part and you were there.
So I think the short answer is clearly the United Nations and this open-ended working group, or the OEWG as it's called, is a place to have these discussions, right? Whether it's the place, I think, is still a little bit contested. It's important to remember that the internet, although it was invented with some funding from the U.S. Department of Defense, was largely a creation of academics, right? It was, Stanford and MIT and Cornell and other places. That's where, the first emails occurred and the like. And so its original governance was by private actors, and then commercial entities realized there was money to be made on the internet, and they became involved. And we started to have, it's in some levels of internet governance, what we would call a multi-stakeholder model. That is some combination of private actors, industry, civil society, and governments working together through things like the Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers, or ICANN, or the Internet Governance Forum, which is also under UN auspices, where multi-stakeholders can get together and discuss internet governance. That said, beginning in like 1998, the Russian Federation said, there's a national security threat with the internets, right? That it's not just going to be for commercial purposes. They had the foresight to see that governments might use it to threaten the security of other states and the like. And they've since that time have proposed, among other things, like a new cyber security treaty. Other governments haven't been too keen on that, but they have responded to the idea that there need to be national security conversations around these topics. And so when I mentioned earlier that in 2013, a group of governmental experts had decided international law applies to cyberspace, that was under the UN General Assembly's auspices to discuss issues of international peace and security. And those groups of governmental experts lasted through about 2021, the last of which operated alongside this OEWG. And so now I think the OEWG has become the place for, let's say, multilateral discussions
Just
about.
for our audience who is watching or listening to us, when you say OEWG, is the open-ended working group that you were part of, that you were there, right?
Yeah. So this OEWG, this open-ended working group, has now become kind of the primary place to have what I might say are multilateral discussions about what should the rules of the road be, what are the norms of behavior, what are the international law rules, how can we build capacity, and also something that we call confidence building measures. That is, measures that when adversaries are not talking to each other or in times of geopolitical stress, what are the things you can do to lower the temperature and avoid escalations into conflict?
The group is pretty interesting, open-ended working group. That means that there is no an ending point for that.
So I think it has like an initial 5-year mandate, and I think ongoing discussions right now are about whether to extend that mandate. One of its advantages has been in that it's open, so that is all UN member states can participate. Whereas the previous group of governmental experts, states had to apply, and originally it was 10 governments could only be in the room, then 15, then 20, then 25. And now I think we're seeing, upwards of 80 to 90 to 100 governments participating in these conversations. I do note, though, that they're not necessarily open in the sense that not all stakeholders can participate. You have to get through no government, if a government vetoes, a single government can exclude anyone from the room. But there are some civil society and there's some industry who are in the room. This last time I was a member of the US delegation, as it were. And so there are some who still think the better forum would be the Internet Governance Forum that I mentioned earlier, that's for all stakeholders. So we kind of have a battle between multi-stakeholder governance and multilateral governance. I don't know. I think that the future is going to have to involve both, if I can be honest.
And from the meeting that you participated and from what we have nowadays, have you seen any cases of success while fighting cyber threats? And if yes, if you could give us some examples.
Yeah, so I think the success, let's be honest, is small steps, incremental steps. I think the successes that the open-ended working group has achieved is they're working on a point of contacts, so that literally that 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, every government knows in every other government where they can call if they're the victim of a cyber operation or something's happening and they want to coordinate. I think that's a success, right? Lines of communication being open on issues like international law. I think the success has been transparency. I think there was a real worry, again, over the last few years, that one state would regard itself engaging in behavior under international law that it thought was lawful, but the victim state thought was unlawful, or maybe even a use of force. And of course, the way international law works is you're not allowed to use force unless in self-defense. And so the worry was that a state was conducting a cyber operation that it didn't think was a use of force. The other state thought it was and responded with self-defense, and you don't have to necessarily respond in kind. It could have been a missile or boots on the ground, and suddenly we've inadvertently found our way into an armed conflict. And so one of the things that the open-ended working group has done is encourage governments and regional organizations to kind of opine on how do the existing international law rules apply to cyberspace. What about the prohibition on the use of force? How would it operate in a cyber context?
This is
What about there's,
interesting
go ahead.
because is it correct to say that hacking nowadays cannot be considered an act of war under international law, but it's like an act of espionage? And is it possible to change those rules, this international law?
So I think I'll give you the lawyer answer, which is it depends. So I think there is widespread, but probably not universal agreement that a sufficiently serious cyber operation, say one that took down a country's power grid for more than a day, or one that, as I think I mentioned, gets into a civilian nuclear power plant and causes it to melt down. I think those could be deemed, just a cyber operation alone, could be deemed a use of force and trigger those sorts of international law rules. I think the espionage has long been something that international law has either tolerated or ignored, right? There's no international law rule prohibiting espionage. And so some cyber operations are just that. Although I do think there's been some pressure. It was one thing when you would go into a filing cabinet in another government's ministry and steal some files. But now the scale of cyber espionage has caused some, I think, to beg the question of like, who's paying for all the costs that this incurs, right? Because, if you're a company and you're told, oh, you've been hacked, but don't worry, the SolarWinds hack, for example, targeted, I think, 18,000 victims, but it only really stole data from like 300 or so. And the response from many was, well, that was really precise. Whoever did it, and it's alleged that the Russian Federation may have had some responsibility. Whoever did it, they were very precise. The problem is that for 17,700 companies and their chief information security officers, their shareholders are not going to be satisfied to hear, oh, we were hacked and they got into our systems, but don't worry, they didn't operate and they didn't exfiltrate our data. You're still going to have to redo your systems, right? Reboot, rebuild your systems and spend a lot of time and effort. And so there is this question of, well, why are private industry, civil society, why are they bearing all the costs for this? Can we actually have some bumpers, like in a bowling lane that keeps the ball in the lane to at least regulate espionage in the same way that we do in warfare, right? That warfare is not unlimited or shouldn't be unlimited. We have international humanitarian law that protects civilians from being targeted. It should protect hospitals from being attacked in a conflict. Can't we do something similar with respect to not only cyber operations and warfare, but things like cyber espionage more broadly?
So can we? Recently, the US government, for example, confirmed in a public way that there is a risk of threats, cyber attacks in the satellites. So are we nowadays, in general, as a society, prepared to deal with those issues?
I think we are
Including
preparing to deal with those issues. I would say that from a regulatory basis, we are playing catch up, right? We have been working on cybersecurity alone for now going on 2 decades. You add in outer space and satellites, to say nothing of artificial intelligence. And I do think there's a risk that not only industry, but bad actors will get ahead of our capacity. So as I said earlier, international law clearly applies to regulate state behavior, but that's not to say that it applies well or sufficiently, right? Like that, there's a difference between saying the law applies and that the law does what we want it to do. And I think the reality is that we've seen over the last several years, we're clearly not yet there when it comes to stopping ransomware, when it comes to stopping or regulating, attacks on the supply chain, so that, when you update your MacBook or your Dell computer, you can be sure that the update itself isn't going to impose some malicious malware into your system where you're going to be either, a victim or a part of some operation that targets others. So I do think there's greater recognition of the national security, the economic, and the humanitarian risks that are posed by cyber threats. And so I do think, you now have entire cyber bureaus at the U.S. Department of State. You have, European governments have cyber ambassadors. So I think that states recognize this is something they need to work on. But I wouldn't say we have any, that we've turned the tide at this point. I think the cyber threats right now are outnumbering the cyber successes.
One of your books, Defending Democracy, is touching a topic that it's very actual. We are living moments of elections in different parts of the world, here in the United States. So how to defend democracies, not only here in the US, but around the world when we have this challenge of cyber threats. Using this example that you described in your book a couple of years ago.
So I think for so long in the cybersecurity, everybody was focused on what we would call the digital Pearl Harbor, or this kind of catastrophic cyber event. And I think that worry remains, although, with the war, say, in Ukraine, showing that it may not be, it's harder than people thought, that, you can target satellites and take them down, but it takes a lot of effort. You can't just, a la Hollywood, type on a computer and, shut off the power. But I do think what people have realized is that misinformation and disinformation is much easier and cheaper to spread than people had previously realized. And so whether, through various social media or other ways, there is the real possibility of deceiving not only your own population, but foreign populations. And so I think there's widespread risk that it's hard to measure, but that elections could be disrupted. Imagine, particularly a robocall, or artificial intelligence call going out and saying, "Hi, this is your, Secretary of Elections, and we've switched the election that you all thought was going to be Tuesday. It's now Wednesday." And people receive this call and they believe it, and so they don't go to the polls the day of the election. They go the next day, and it's too late. The votes have already been tabulated. I think that's a real risk. I do think we're starting to see industry waking up to it. So in Munich last month, there was a Tech Accord Munich Compact, which is a bunch of tech companies got together, and they've committed to oppose the use of malicious artificial intelligence online in ways that would affect elections. I think governments are rallying around this as well, and particularly in the group of 20, the G20 and others, you see commitments to try and stop foreign election interference. I think the tricky thing, of course, is where the line is. It's one thing for a former president or even a current president to take out an ad in the New York Times and say, "I support candidate X." I think that's free speech, and governments should be allowed to express an opinion on what other governments they like and don't like. The challenge is when do you cross that line and start pretending to be, here in the U.S., people pretending to be U.S. citizens who weren't, pretending to set up rallies that actually weren't real, and driving people's opinions in ways that was much more malicious and malign and worthy of regulation.
Could you describe a moment when you wrote the book, Defending Democracies, and what led you into this topic? And if you see, you already spoke about this answering my last question, but if much have changed from when you wrote to what we have now?
So I do think, right, so I worked with the Dean of Cornell Law School, Jens Olin was my co-author, and we put the book together in the aftermath of the 2016 U.S. election, where it had come to light that the Russian government had a troll farm of government-funded, online folks who were out there trying, in some ways, to increase polarization, right? To try and drive people further apart. And it's still hard to know if it affected the election in any way, but it got us thinking, hey, we need to think about this, and we need to think about it not just as international lawyers, but to bring in political scientists, to bring in international relations experts, to bring in social scientists, people who think about how persuasion works and the like. And so we put together this volume that was interdisciplinary, that said, let's try and come up with a research agenda of how do we think about foreign election interference? How do we think about domestic election interference? And I think, if you look around the world, the good news is that I do think it's on the agenda. And I think that there's widespread agreement that we should stop foreign election interference, that governments should not engage that they should not engage in malicious election interference against governments they don't like, or even governments they do like. The challenge, I think, is getting into the details, right? Just like in asking, how does international law apply to regulate cybersecurity? We're having the same challenge of what are the steps that need to be taken. I think the first one that I think probably has the most success is resiliency, is getting the domestic population to know what a deep fake is, right? That no longer, when apropos of the news this week, when the United Kingdom, the monarchy releases a photograph, that you can rely that it's actually an untouched photograph, right? That it can be manipulated, that, you know, somebody could appear to be in a place that they are not, or that somebody's voice could be added to something to they call it a deep fake, to fake people out. And so I think we're still in the beginning of trying to figure out how do we regulate that in a political context that doesn't disrupt democratic processes of elections.
Mm-hmm. Well, our audience is mainly foreign journalists, as me, based here in the US, working for big media outlets abroad. And so some sources for us to inform ourselves and to research. We just spoke about at least one of your books this book is available, right? For those who is interested in reading and knowing. You already mentioned an event in Munich. This is in April. Do you think that this is something that foreign journalists might be aware what is happening there?
Sure. So things to look at are like, so this Munich Security Conference Tech Accord, I think it's called the Munich Compact. I think you can find via your search engine, whether it's Google or Bing or what have you. I think that it is actually interesting to reflect for journalists, as we see particularly the rise of artificial intelligence, that it's going to require not just, you know, your usual interviewing people and reporting, but some learning, right? Some capacity building among journalists to understand what are cybersecurity threats to confidentiality, to integrity, to availability, and how does artificial intelligence exacerbate them? And I think there's different ways to do that. So one of the things I do, is we bring together every year in Valencia a group of journalists, diplomats, and academics for like a 3-day boot camp on what is cyber threats, how do they operate, kind of, having technical trainers train those of us who are going to write and think about these topics. And there's other efforts like that. Cyber Law International is a group that does that for international law. I chaired or co-convened something called the Oxford Process on international law protections in cyberspace. So if any of your viewers or listeners are interested, we have a compendium, the Oxford Process Compendium, that tries to talk about, some work we did on during the pandemic about how do you protect healthcare, how do you protect elections, how do you regulate information operations. That's some useful background. So there are resources out there. There's also something called the Tallinn Manual on international law, on cyber operations, that goes into the international law. So there's definitely resources for journalists who want to understand these issues in more detail. But I think, the first step is to actually talking or finding yourself a source, someone who is really an expert, whether in industry or academia, that understands and can explain to you what AI is, what is machine learning, what are, LLMs and the like, and what is the difference between, a ransomware attack and a directed denial of service attack. Because to be able to inform our population, right, to deal with things like election interference, it's you, the journalists, who are going to have to relay to the public the information.
You're giving an advice as learn about the technologies, at least a little.
Yeah, learn about the technology so that you can then help your readers understand the technology, which will be important for things like defending democracies, so that a population can understand and be aware of what the threats are and what the potential solutions are, so they can, evaluate them in a more informed way.
I have a feeling that this is starting. We are starting to talk about the need to regulate artificial intelligence. President Biden here in Washington, D.C. last year received a group of business men and women that they are developing this type of technology to discuss in an open way and to listen from them their commitment, to secure the data of users, for example. So this is something that it has been built. It's being built now. So you just said that the artificial intelligence can amplify this problem of the cyber threat. How is this related?
So I mean, one of the things to think about when you think about artificial intelligence, right, or is the autonomy of the technology, right? The ability of the technology to operate independent of human control. And that's actually been true in cyber for some time, right? Like a worm, right, is malware that's built that it kind of self-propagates. It navigates its own way, and sometimes with surprising results, right? That the famous, it's viruses as well. The famous, Stuxnet, which was allegedly a U.S. and Israeli operation that targeted Iranian nuclear facilities, ended up not just on those, networks in Iran, not just at the Natanz nuclear power plant, but on all Siemens programmable logic controllers, PLCs throughout the globe. That, we still don't know whether that was intended or surprise, but so you have that sort of spread. And the question is, artificial intelligence may allow that to happen at speeds and scales we've not yet seen. There's talk of the idea that the AI will be able to write new malware, right? Instead of having a human deciding what malware there is the AI can write it. And then the AI might be able to adjust it as it sees what sort of defenses there are. And so I would say there's also that possibility on the defense side, right? That AI will allow people to recognize maybe when you're hacked or your computer is behaving in unusual ways. It can detect patterns that you or I may not. So it's going to operate both on offense and defense, but it's going to operate at speeds and scales beyond, necessarily human processing. And it's going to take some real effort to figure out how to keep humans in the loop, whether it's in cybersecurity or lethal autonomous weapons or outer space, use of satellites and the like.
Well, I am an optimist, but I don't know if it's possible to answer this in a short way. Can we ever stop cyber threats?
I don't know that. I think it will be a cat and mouse game. I think cyber threats are with us for the duration, but that doesn't mean that we can't do things that make cyberspace more stable, more secure. I'd like to see it more rights respecting, right? How do we make sure that, cyberspace is regulated, for people rather than just for, the security of states. So my own view, for example, as an international lawyer, is I'm not against a treaty. I actually think that we should have a treaty that protects people from states, right, that are out there hacking now and maybe without realizing their limits, rather than a treaty that protects, states from people, as some autocratic governments would like, to do more to kind of control the domestic population. So I think international law will be a piece of this, but I don't think there's a silver bullet solution. I think it's going to be a whole of government, whole of society responses are going to be needed. And I think it's going to be important for journalists to play their part in that effort.
Okay, and you're part of, our effort, helping us with so much valuable information. So Duncan Hollis, thank you so much for joining us today in this educational program and for this interview. Thank you.
It was a real pleasure. Thank you for having me.
I spoke today with Duncan Hollis, lawyer, author, and expert on treaties and the application of international law to cyberspace. See you next time.